I buried Thomas 6 months ago. Yesterday, I watched him pick out groceries. I had spent half a year memorizing the cold texture of his headstone, standing until my limbs grew heavy and the wind bit through my coat. 6 months of waking up to a hollow house. 6 months of reaching across the mattress for a warmth that was no longer there. I had been forced to learn how to exist in the silence he left behind. Or, so I believed. That morning, I went to the store simply because life demands mundane things like bread and milk, even when your world has collapsed. I was staring at rows of canned goods, struck by the cruelty of how normally the world kept turning, when I heard it. His voice. It wasn't a shout or a call. It was just a quiet, habitual sound. A dry cough followed by a low grumble about the cost of soup. It was the exact cadence I had lived with for 41 years. The same sound that used to drift from the porch while he worked on his crosswords. A sound I had accepted I would never hear again in this life. I froze. I turned with my heart hammering against my ribs, my body recognizing him before my logic could catch up. There he was, 3 aisles down, clutching a basket and squinting at labels. It was Thomas. The same broad, slightly weathered shoulders, the silver hair that always looked unbrushed, and the faint scar over his brow from an old fall he used to joke about. The man I had laid in the earth, the man whose name I had seen etched in granite. The jar in my hand hit the floor, shattering and spraying red sauce across the tiles like an open wound. People turned. Someone asked if I needed help, but I was already moving. "Thomas!" I cried out, my voice cracking under the weight of his name. "Thomas, it's me!" He looked up. For a fleeting, desperate second, I waited for his eyes to soften, for that familiar smile to break across his face. Instead, there was only a blank, polite confusion. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone cautious and distant. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else." The rejection hurt worse than the funeral. Mistaken? As if 4 decades could be erased by a polite sentence. As if I didn't know every line and shadow of his face. "No," I whispered, closing the distance between us. "No, Thomas. It's Eleanor. Your wife." He actually took a step back. That retreat felt like a physical blow. Thomas had never moved away from me, not even in our darkest moments. "My name is Daniel," he insisted. "Daniel Brooks. I don't know who you are." The voice was identical, deep, slightly gravelly, the voice that had anchored my life. With shaking fingers, I pulled up a photo on my phone from last July. His last birthday. We were on the deck, his arm draped around me. I thrust the screen toward him. "Look," I pleaded. "Look at this. You remember this day? You complained about the heat and burned the steaks." He looked at the image. For a heartbeat, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of hesitation, a slight tensing of his jaw. Then he just shook his head. "I've never seen that picture," he said. "You're clearly going through something very painful." He reached out and touched my shoulder. The weight of his hand nearly leveled me. It was his touch, the same heat, the same pressure he used to calm my nerves. "Please," he added gently, "sit down. Get some water." I looked down at his left hand. "Show me your fingers," I demanded. He looked annoyed but held up his hand. There it was. The crooked pinky he'd broken as a teenager fixing his mother's roof. The finger I used to trace when we held hands. My stomach turned. "I have to leave," he said abruptly, turning his cart away. "I hope you find some peace." He walked away, leaving me trembling while a clerk cleaned up the mess at my feet. People whispered about the poor woman, but they were wrong. I wasn't just grieving. I was terrified. Because as he vanished toward the registers, one thought drowned out everything else. I knew my husband was dead, but I knew that man was Thomas. If my husband was still breathing, then who was resting in that grave? Whatever the truth was, I knew my world was about to fracture in ways I couldn't comprehend. I should have walked away. I should have driven home, bolted the door, and convinced myself that my mind had finally snapped under the weight of loss. That would have been the easy path. But I stayed. I watched him from the shadows of the aisle as he reached the checkout. He paid with cash. I noted that immediately, because Thomas lived by his credit cards and detested loose change. This man didn't even ask for a receipt. He folded the bills with a slow, deliberate precision, pressing the edges flat with his thumb, a gesture so familiar it made my throat tighten. My breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. When he headed for the exit, my feet followed without a second thought. I trailed him at a distance, ducking behind displays and faking interest in random products. I felt both absurd and more alert than I had been in months. Outside, the cool air bit at my skin. He began loading bags into a battered white sedan, its paint faded and a noticeable dent marring the rear door. It wasn't the car Thomas had owned, the one he spent every Saturday polishing until it shone. Yet the way he organized the groceries was unmistakable. Heavy items at the base, bread positioned carefully on top, eggs tucked in last. I committed the license plate to memory before he pulled out of the lot. I stood there for a moment, hands balled into fists, then walked to my own car. It was the vehicle Thomas had bought for me 2 years before the crash, obsessed with making sure I was in something safe and dependable. I pulled out and followed him. I kept a careful distance, staying a few cars back so I wouldn't be spotted. My pulse was thundering so loud I feared it might give me away. We drove through familiar streets before turning into a neighborhood I'd rarely set foot in. The houses here were smaller, older, and more weathered. He eventually slowed down and turned onto a quiet, tree-lined road. He parked in front of a modest pale green house with a white picket fence and wind chimes hanging silently on the porch. He stepped out with his bags just as the front door swung open. A woman appeared, perhaps a decade younger than me, her dark hair pulled back and her face devoid of makeup. She wore a lived-in sweater and a smile that wasn't just polite. It was intimate. She leaned in and kissed his cheek. My vision blurred. She took a bag from him, her lips moving as she spoke softly. I couldn't catch the words, but I recognized the comfort of their rhythm. Then, 2 children, a boy and a girl, maybe 8 and 10 years old, burst out of the house. They sprinted toward him, shouting, "Grandpa!" The girl asked about ice cream, and he laughed. That laugh. It hit me like a physical strike. It was lopsided and warm, the exact sound that had filled my kitchen for 40 years. The man crouched down, letting the kids climb over him while he balanced the groceries with practiced ease. The woman watched them, her hand resting naturally on his back. They all disappeared inside, and the door clicked shut. I sat motionless in my car, parked half a block away, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. The sun poured through the glass, warming my skin, and only then did I realize I was crying, not a loud, gasping sob, just a steady stream of tears. 41 years of marriage, 6 months of agonizing mourning, and endless nights whispering his name into the void. And here he was, alive, laughing, and holding children that didn't belong to me. I pulled out my phone and began documenting everything. The house, the car, the number on the door. My hands were shaking so violently that half the photos were a blur, but a few were sharp enough. As the light began to fail, I finally started the engine. I don't remember the drive back. I only remember sitting in my dark garage, zooming in on his face on my screen. Every line was a match. Every shadow was right. When I finally stepped into my hollow house, one question drowned out the silence. If Thomas was alive, who had I buried? I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table under the glow of a single lamp, surrounded by old photo albums spread out like evidence at a crime scene. I moved through them with surgical precision. I compared the shots I took that afternoon, his profile through the car window, his turn toward the house. with our past. Our wedding, the day his first gray hairs appeared, a beach trip where his shirt had hiked up. Every detail was identical. The scar from the ladder fall, the small mole near his collarbone he was always self-conscious about, even the slight asymmetry of his ears. These weren't hallucinations born of grief. These were physical facts. I pressed my hand to my mouth to steady my breathing. Twins don't share identical scars. Strangers don't share a map of memories written into their skin. I stood up and paced, my footsteps echoing through rooms that suddenly felt like a movie set. This was supposed to be the home Thomas left for me, but now it felt like a lie. At 3:40 a.m., I picked up the phone and called my son. It rang 4 times before Lucas answered, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Mom, do you know what time it is?" "I need you to come over right now," I said. "Mom, it's the middle of the night. Did something happen?" "Yes," I replied. "Something happened." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. "Mom, if this is about Dad again, we've already talked about this. You've been through a nightmare, Mom. Loss does strange things to the mind." "I saw him yesterday," I repeated, my voice steady. "I saw your father, and he was breathing." A long silence followed, then a sharp, controlled intake of breath. "Mom, what did you take? Did you skip your meds?" "I followed him to his front door, Lucas. I know where he lives. I've seen his new family." My lack of emotion seemed to unnerve him more than if I had been screaming. "Stay right there," he finally ordered. "Don't move. I'm coming over." The line went dead. I walked to the bathroom and stared at the stranger in the glass. Dark circles carved hollows under my eyes. My hair was a tangled mess, and I looked a decade older than I had 6 months ago. When Lucas arrived 40 minutes later, he didn't bother to knock. He used his old key, just like he did when he was a boy. He found me at the kitchen table, drowning in a sea of old photographs. "Mom," he said softly, "what is this?" I didn't explain. I just handed him my phone. I watched his expression as he scrolled through the images. First came confusion, then a flicker of denial, and finally, a cold, hard fear. He swallowed and handed the device back to me. He looks like Dad," he said, choosing his words with surgical care. "But doppelgangers exist. It's a coincidence." "Did you look at his hand?" I asked. "The finger?" Lucas rubbed his face with both hands. "Mom, we buried him. You were there. I was there. The whole town was there." "It was a closed casket," I reminded him. He looked away. "They told us it was better that way. The accident was... it was horrific." "Did you actually see his body, Lucas?" His jaw tightened until it looked like stone. "No, neither did you." The kitchen suddenly felt like a tomb. I stood up. "I'm going back there. And you're coming with me." "Mom, this isn't healthy. This is an obsession." "Are you coming or am I going alone?" He hesitated, and in that pause the first cracks appeared in the story he had been telling himself. "Fine," he snapped. "We'll go. We'll go so you can see with your own eyes that it's a stranger. Then you have to let this go." We drove in a suffocating silence. When we turned onto that quiet street with the pale green house, my pulse began to drum against my ribs. "That's it. Right there," I whispered. Lucas parked a few houses down. We waited, 2 ghosts in a parked car. After a few minutes, the door opened. The man stepped out. Lucas leaned forward, the color draining from his face until he was ghostly pale. He watched, paralyzed, as the man climbed into his car and drove right past us. When I turned to my son, tears were carving paths down his cheeks. "Mom," he choked out. Before he could say another word, I knew. Whatever lie he had been guarding was finally shattering him. Lucas didn't start the engine. He collapsed against the steering wheel, his shoulders heaving with silent, violent sobs. I had seen him cry when his marriage ended, when he lost his dog, but this was different. This wasn't just sadness, it was a total collapse of character. "Mom," he finally gasped, "I am so incredibly sorry." Those words were a confession. Sorry meant he knew. Sorry meant I wasn't crazy. "Tell me," I said. My voice felt like it was coming from miles away. "Tell me every single thing. Right now." He lifted his head, his eyes raw and bleeding with a look I'd never seen before. Pure, unadulterated shame. Dad didn't die in that crash. The words didn't break me. I was already broken. I just nodded. "Go on." He took a jagged breath. "He had another family, Mom. For over 20 years. That woman, Claudia. He lived a double life with her. He told me it started as a mistake. Then it just became his reality." I stared out at the empty street. "How long have you known?" "About 3 years," Lucas confessed. "I found out when I was helping him with the marina business books. I saw the duplicate bills, 2 sets of utilities, 2 insurance policies, 2 lives. The marina supply business, the job that kept him on the road, the job I had defended 1,000 times when people said he worked too much. And you kept his secret." He wiped his face with his sleeve, looking like a guilty child. "He begged me. He said it would kill you if you knew. He said you'd take everything, the business, the house, the life he built." "The life we built," I corrected. Lucas nodded, miserable. 6 months ago, he wanted out of the lie. He wanted to be with her permanently. But a divorce would have cost him half of everything. He decided it would be cleaner if you just thought he was dead. My hands began to tremble. "Cleaner for who?" "For him," Lucas whispered. "And for me." I turned to him, my eyes narrowing. "For you?" He looked at the floorboards. "If he died, the assets passed to me. He moved most of the cash into offshore accounts first, but the rest came to me. I thought I could take care of you. I'd give you an allowance, make sure you never wanted for anything." An allowance? Like a child? Like a charity case? I felt a coldness settle in my bones. How did he fake the death? Lucas swallowed hard. "There was a man. A homeless man. Terminal. No family except a niece he hadn't seen in years. Dad paid them both. They staged the accident. Dad used the man's ID. When he died in the hospital, it was under Dad's name. The fire, it made identification impossible. The casket stayed shut." The world seemed to tilt. I remembered the police call. I remembered Lucas practically dragging me away from the hospital, insisting I shouldn't see the remains. The funeral, the flowers, the people holding my hand. "You let me bury a stranger," I said, the words tasting like ash. "You watched me mourn a man who was still out there laughing." Lucas broke down again. I didn't know how to stop it once the wheels started turning. I thought it was kinder this way, that you'd heal faster if you thought he was a hero who died too soon. "Kinder?" I let out a sharp, hollow laugh. "You stole the truth from me. You stole my grief and replaced it with a hollow lie." I closed my eyes, focusing on the rhythm of my breath. "Take me home." "Mom, we have to talk about the logistics." "Take me home." The drive back was silent. When he pulled into my driveway, I got out without a word. "Mom, please," he called out as I walked away. I didn't look back. Back inside my own 4 walls, I sat on the edge of the mattress and surveyed the wreckage of the life I thought I'd built. 41 years of devotion, of sacrifice, of absolute faith in the man sleeping beside me. It had all been an elaborate theatrical performance, but the moment the curtain fell, one thing became certain. I was finished being the woman who suffered in the dark. Whatever came next wouldn't be forgiveness. It would be a reckoning. For 3 days, I existed in total isolation. I didn't return Lucas's calls. I ignored every frantic text. Twice, I watched from an upstairs window as he pulled into my driveway, only to drive away when I refused to answer the door. For 4 decades, I had been conditioned to respond, to mend, to fix. This time, I chose a cold, calculating silence. I barely slept, but the tears had stopped. The grief had been incinerated, leaving behind nothing but a sharp, steady clarity. I replayed every word Lucas had confessed, not as a grieving widow, but as a lead investigator, a staged death, a stolen identity, diverted wealth, forged signatures, a purchased corpse. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a criminal enterprise. On the fourth morning, I rose before the sun. I took a long, hot shower to ground myself and dressed with intention, choosing an outfit that made me feel powerful rather than pitiable. I was done being the widow everyone looked at with sad eyes. When I checked my reflection, the woman staring back was older, but her eyes were wide awake. I was done crying. I was ready to think. I drove to a nondescript building downtown, third floor, frosted glass, and a simple sign, Private Investigations. The man inside was in his 60s, with thinning hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen every lie ever told. I need to locate someone, I told him, sitting down without an invitation. He leaned back, assessing me. Missing or hiding? Hiding, I replied, and legally deceased. That hooked him. I laid out the facts, just the facts. No emotions, no stories about our marriage, just the accident, the closed casket, the new identity, the greenhouse, and the children calling him Grandpa. I showed him the photographs. He listened in a silence that felt like professional respect. If this is true, he said slowly, we're looking at identity fraud and massive financial deception. It'll take time and it'll be expensive. I can pay, I said, not missing a beat. I want proof, bank trails, property deeds, forged filings, everything. He named a steep price. I didn't blink as I signed the check. I want the truth documented. I don't want suspicions, I want evidence. He gave me a grim smile. I can do that. Over the next week, I became a ghost in my own life. I haunted the street with the pale green house at all hours, disguised by hats and sunglasses, sitting in my car like a predator. I learned his new rhythm. He left at the same time every morning. He returned like clockwork. Weekends were for the grandkids. Sundays were for the pews. To the neighbors, he was a pillar of the community. I learned his new name and the modest life he'd built on the ruins of mine. I watched that woman touch his arm exactly the way I used to. I watched him smile with the confidence of a man who thought he'd buried his past deep enough. He was wrong. 7 days later, the investigator called. I have enough for a full brief. You should come in. The folder he slid across the desk was heavy. It contained a fake birth certificate issued years after Thomas was born. It showed bank accounts opened under an alias with nearly $2 million moved just before the accident. There were tax records linking him to 2 separate lives for over 20 years. Then I reached the final page. Phone logs. Constant, regular communication between my husband and my son. Before the crash, after the funeral, and throughout every single month I spent mourning alone in that empty house. Lucas hadn't just been a witness. He was a participant. I closed the file. Thank you. Walking out of that office, a strange peace settled over me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about dignity. They thought I would mourn until I faded away. They mistook my silence for fragility. They were mistaken. The storm hadn't passed. It had simply gathered its strength. I didn't confront Lucas immediately. That was the hardest part, suppressing the urge to throw the truth in his face. But anger is impulsive. Strategy is patient. I took the folder home and memorized every transaction. Every signature was a calculated move. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a cold-blooded exit strategy. The next morning, I met with a specific kind of attorney, one who specialized in fraud and white-collar crime. She was sharp, clinical, and didn't waste a second. "This is a criminal conspiracy," she said, flipping through the records. "Your husband committed identity theft and financial fraud. Your son aided and profited. You have grounds for full restitution and criminal charges." "What's the next step?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. "A confession would be the final nail," she said. "Specifically from your son. We also need the original asset transfer documents. With those, the case is airtight." I knew exactly where those papers would be. Lucas kept an office at the Marina warehouse. He'd given me an emergency key years ago, one I'd never had a reason to use. Until now. But first, I needed him to talk. I called him that afternoon. "Mom!" he answered, his voice thick with relief. "Are you okay?" I've been terrified. "I'm tired, Lucas," I said, letting a scripted softness enter my voice. "I don't want to fight with you anymore. I just need to understand the full picture so I can finally move on." Relief flooded his voice. "Of course, Mom. Whatever you need. Let's do lunch tomorrow somewhere quiet." He agreed instantly, his guard completely down. That night, I tucked a small digital recorder into my handbag. I practiced keeping my expression neutral and my hands steady. I rehearsed my questions until they sounded like the curious musings of a confused widow rather than the interrogation of a prosecutor. At lunch, I played the part. I let him talk. I asked when the scheme began, how the funds were shifted, whose signatures were forged, and where the sale proceeds had vanished. Every answer came to him with ease. He was unguarded, convinced that I was still his predictable, fragile mother, a safe harbor for his secrets. He didn't notice the recorder. He didn't realize that every word was a nail in his coffin. While we ate, my attorney and the investigator were already dismantling his world. Armed with the evidence I'd provided, they had secured emergency access to his financial records. The paper trail told the rest. Forged authorizations, unauthorized sales, and vast sums of money wired directly into accounts Lucas controlled. By the time we finished our coffee, the trap had snapped shut. That afternoon, my attorney filed a formal complaint with the district attorney. The charges were a laundry list of felonies, fraud, forgery, financial exploitation, and identity theft. 2 hours later, she called with the news. "The case is moving. Warrants are being issued." I sat in my living room after the call ended. The house was deathly quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. I thought of the woman I was 6 months ago, the one who sobbed into a cold pillow and begged for a dead man to return. That woman wouldn't have survived this. But she was gone. I didn't feel a rush of triumph. I simply felt resolved. The truth was no longer a burden I carried alone. It belonged to the law now. The first call came at daybreak. It wasn't Lucas. It was my lawyer. "The warrants were served. Your son was taken into custody this morning." There was no resistance. I closed my eyes. Somewhere across the city, Lucas was being handcuffed, read his rights, and led into a patrol car in front of the neighbors who once admired him. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an inevitability. An hour later, my phone began to vibrate incessantly. Lucas calling over and over. I didn't answer. Then a frantic, shaking text from his wife. "What have you done?" I placed the phone face down on the counter and brewed a pot of coffee. By noon, the scandal had ripped through the family. Cousins, old friends, people who had wept with me at the funeral. They were all calling now, desperate for answers to questions they weren't prepared to hear. I ignored every single one. At 2 p.m., my attorney called again. There's more. The identity he's using, Daniel Brooks, is being formally invalidated. All accounts under that name are frozen. He has nowhere left to run. That was the moment I knew I had to see him. Not to argue or explain, but to close the book. I drove back to that quiet street with the pale green house. This time, I parked right in front. I didn't hide behind sunglasses. I walked straight to the door and rang the bell. Claudia opened it. She looked at me with the cautious politeness reserved for a stranger. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for Daniel," I said. "It's urgent." She hesitated, then nodded toward the back. "He's in the yard." He was standing by the fence, tools in hand, sleeves rolled up. For a second, he didn't notice me. Then he turned. The recognition was instantaneous. "Eleanor," he whispered. I held out the envelope. "These are legal documents," I said, my voice as calm as a still lake. "You should read them." His hands shook as he took the papers. His eyes darted across the legalese, and I watched the blood drain from his face. "What is this?" he stammered. "What did you do?" "I did nothing," I replied. "I simply told the truth." He looked toward the house, panicked. "Does she know?" I raised my voice just enough to be heard through the screen door. "She knows now." Claudia appeared behind him, her face a mask of confusion. "No. What's happening?" "I am his wife," I said, looking her in the eye. "His legal wife of 40 years. The man you know as Daniel does not exist." The silence that followed was suffocating. Claudia stared at him, her world crumbling. "Is this true?" He closed his eyes, unable to look at her. She recoiled as if the earth had shifted. "You said you were a widower," she whispered. "You said you had no one." "I had someone," I said. "Me." He collapsed onto the concrete, his legs giving out. "Eleanor, please. I can explain." "No," I said. "You've explained enough with your silence. You chose a lie. You chose to erase me." Sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with every second. "They're coming," he said hoarsely. "Yes." I turned to walk away. "Eleanor!" he cried out behind me. "For the years we shared. For what we were." I stopped, but I didn't turn around. "What we were was real to me," I said. "And that is exactly why you will never understand what you destroyed." I walked to my car as the police pulled into the driveway. I didn't look back as they led him away. The light had finally reached the truth, and nothing built on a foundation of lies can survive the sun. Thomas died 3 weeks later. It wasn't the dramatic ending people expect. No courtroom showdown, no final words. He had a heart attack in a holding cell while awaiting trial. The call came early in the morning, clinical and cold. "He passed at 5:20 a.m., the voice said. "You're listed as next of kin." I didn't feel relief or sorrow. I felt a profound distance, as if they were talking about a character in a book I'd finished years ago. "Cremate him," I said. "Scatter the ashes at sea. No service, no memorial." There was a pause. "Are you certain?" "Yes. He has taken enough of my life. He isn't getting one last performance." The law moved forward without him. The fake identity was wiped out. The accounts were returned to their rightful status. The assets he had hidden or transferred were recovered and redistributed by the court. Everything that was stolen was brought back into the light. Lucas took a plea deal. He was sentenced to prison for fraud and forgery. It wasn't a life sentence, but it was long enough for him to sit with the weight of what he'd done. We spoke once after he was sentenced. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about clarity. "I love you," I told him, "but love does not grant you an escape from the consequences of your choices." He just nodded. For the first time in his life, he didn't try to manipulate the conversation. Months have passed. The house feels different now, lighter, airier. I redecorated, not to bury the past, but to reclaim my space. I've returned to the things I used to love. I travel. I laugh. I sleep deeply. Grief didn't break me. Silence did. And the truth saved me. One afternoon, I visited the cemetery where a stranger lay buried under my husband's name. I stood there for a moment, not to mourn a man, but to say goodbye to the woman I used to be. That grave didn't hold Thomas. It held my innocence. I left without looking back. My life is smaller now, quieter in some ways, but stronger in every way that counts. I no longer confuse loyalty with self-erasure. I no longer believe that love requires me to be quiet. I've learned that dignity isn't something given to you by a marriage or a name. It's something you claim the moment you refuse to be lied to. And I learned that no matter how many years were stolen, it is never too late to choose yourself. That choice changes everything.